And this is part two of a conversation we started last week with Michael Brenes. And Michael Brenes, to reintroduce you, is the co director of the Brady Johnson program in Grand Strategy, which we were just speaking about, and a lecturer in history at Yale, and a senior non resident fellow at the Center for International Policy. Welcome back, Michael.
Oh, thanks, Sam. This was great. I loved being here on the first time. So
Y-
last week, and look
Yep.
forward to the conversation ahead. So
Well, the world needs historians and good
hopefully,
historians, and and so this won't be the last time. We're going to have you back a lot. And the I asked you back last time because we were talking about an article you wrote for the New Republic back then
Mhm.
on the pendulum. And if anyone in the audience right now has not watched that video or read the post or read the article, you really should go back and check it out. It I'll be honest, it's kind of come up in conversation a lot over the past week,
Huh.
with other guests that I've been on and just here and there. It was a really amazing article. But this week we're here to talk about your book, The Rivalry:
Yeah.
How Great Power Competition. I'm looking at it, it's backwards, so it's throwing me off in the count. How great power competition threatens peace and weakens democracy. Um, and I wanted to talk about this last week, but it's as we're seeing, news of the president of Taiwan sort of not, making diplomatic stops in the United States, and now there's news from China, which maybe we'll talk about in a little bit.
Hmm.
I wanted to really dig into this book. Um, it was published in January, which is like
Yeah.
about several
Plenty
decades
soon. Yeah.
ago.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know? Yeah. So I
Right.
want to talk about what's changed, but I want to set the table first. What was your motivation for writing this book, and can you tell us a little bit about the premise of the book to start?
Sure. So again, thanks for having me, Sam.
Of
Thanks for
course.
everyone who's joining the live stream. So I and a co-author, the co-author of mine, Van Jackson, who I wrote the book with, we started exchanging messages around 2022 about what Joe Biden was doing in terms of U.S. relations with China. We thought that Biden seemed to be in a position unlike Trump, who Trump during his first term was all about just great power competition for the sake of it.
Right.
He was just like, we have to go after China. China's an enemy, and not really explaining why, just that China was rivaling the United States. And Biden, I think, accepted some of those premises, but sought to build and improve upon them because Biden made comments and ultimately justified the passage of the IRA and the CHIPS Act and the Infrastructure Act as bulwarks against Chinese aggression. And the idea behind those three pieces of legislation, I think Biden's approach was we can use China rivalry to outcompete China, but also to provide jobs, to create infrastructure, to get the United States ahead, perhaps even of China on climate, and really
Sure.
revive American democracy in the process. And those arguments seem to be very similar to ones that Democrats made in the Cold War, when it was thought that we could use competition with the Soviet Union to revive democracy. The
Right.
Cold War could create jobs in many parts of the country through defense spending. The Cold War, through investments in technology, that could allow the United States to outcompete the Soviet Union. And we tried to think, okay, what are the trade-offs of that? Yes, those things did happen. The Cold War did bring a prosperity to certain Americans. It did encourage the United States to to deal with and confront its racist past. Dealing with the civil rights movement and things like that. But the Cold War also led to people being accused of being communists when they weren't communists. It led to people losing their jobs. It actually led to a lot of inequality. And so the idea behind the book was, okay, if this is what great power competition is, how actually will it not help democracy? And how is it
Mhm.
insufficient as a means to revive democracy? And going back to our conversation last week, is how is it insufficient in our view to create a coalition that could constrain Trump, right? great
right.
power competition against China is going to provide, and it already is, I think, some jobs. It's going to provide investments in infrastructure. It's going to provide investments in climate. But those things that it's doing aren't enough. And it's really a drop in the overall bucket. And it's certainly not going to be able to outcompete China on things like climate technology or EVs. So better to take stock of where we were, what we've done, and we try to argue in the book that if we think about great power competition going forward, there's going to be a lot of negative repercussions, and we try to come up in the book with a better alternative to competition, a more cooperative approach to U.S. foreign policy, or dealing with China on certain things that we can deal with. I'm not going to be able to cooperate with China on everything, but ultimately coming up with a more internationalist vision of the world and trying to create better conditions for peace and prosperity at home and abroad, and revive democracy in the process.
There's a lot there. I
Yeah.
think, if you think about it, coming up in the 80s, our national identity was being the opposition to the Soviet Union, right? I mean,
Yeah,
it
totally.
it it was even less about what the Cold War could offer us, but how we identified ourselves as Cold Warriors or as Americans. We were the opposite of our enemies or our antagonists. So there was a sense of nationalism that came with that. Um, but I'm curious about this because it does seem like when we decide our national priorities or our priorities as a city or our priorities as human beings, we just decide we're going to do something and then that's what we do.
Yeah,
Right.
right.
It's a little, we just make a decision that this is our priority now. How did we end up making that? I mean, I don't want to go too deep into the Cold War and post war
Sure.
era, but it seemed like such a gripping narrative in the late 40s, 50s, 60s. How, how did we find value in that antagonism? And was it a worthwhile antagonistic sort of setup, us versus the Soviets or us versus another great power?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think there was, by the late 1940s, even before that, concerns about Soviet behavior, the Soviet Union being a closed society, an autarkic economically society, but also autocratic society. It was hard to discern what Soviet behavior was about. And by the early 1950s, certainly after the Korean War, it seemed to be okay. The Soviet Union looks to be a authoritarian menace and will look to spread eastward, if not westward. And that is into the United States. And I think the arguments then, and they're made now, is that, well, this gave Americans purpose. To your point, like the
Sure.
idea we can rally behind an enemy, it will unite the country, and we can all find value as Americans in trying to beat back this authoritarian threat to democracy and to capitalism and to freedom. I think that became, of course, I mean, this is sort of a leading point, but it's a bit too simplistic of a narrative. And again, this is sort of
Mhm.
that goes back to the point about the book, is that we try to raise points in the book about, yeah, there were benefits to the Cold War. It did rally some Americans, and gave this sort of a sense of patriotic fervor, but that also, was very divisive.
Sure.
Left was divided, and the people within the left, kind of with during the New Deal, were purged out of the Democratic Party. Not even communists or socialists, but people who were just sort of, looked to be communists were purged out of the NAACP. Those things aren't good. And I think that kind of has fractured American politics, fractured the Democratic Party, I think, to a large extent. But I think the end of the Cold War, to bring it back to more contemporaneous issues, that was another moment of like, okay, haha, this was all worth it. The trade offs that we suffered in the Cold War, the wars abroad like Vietnam, which were failed wars, or the coups that led to dictators coming to power, or that led to the Iranian Revolution, kind of in a circuitous way, right? Like that, like the
Right.
blowback that happened, that was all worth it because communism fell and the Soviet Union now is gone, and what's left? Cuba and North Korea, and that's nothing. And I think that is a memory that is, again, very simplistic, but is informing how we think about Cold War competition, or sorry. competition with China in terms of a new Cold War.
Right.
Oh, we can win a competition with with China because we won a competition with the Soviet Union, and kind of subsuming history, or trying to fit history into a particular moment, and making it being therefore flattening and anachronistic. I think that's what's happening now, and I don't think we're in a new Cold War with China. I think people certainly on the right think that, but I hope we're not. Let's put it that way, because that's disastrous for the world, and it puts us back on, again, I think, on a bad footing for thinking about a better a better foreign policy and a better America. But I think that's a comforting narrative now, where we can sort of win against China. And I don't think there's,
Right.
and I guess the question, I'll stop here, is sort of, what does winning against China look like? And no one has sufficiently answered that question for me. People have tried to answer it by saying, well, there is no winning because competition is protracted and it's not never going to end. But that's not a very comforting explanation, I think, to me, or perhaps many of the American people.
Well, I think, just as a side note, Tim in the chat says it got us to the moon. I'm sure he's referring to the Cold War, and I think that
Yes.
is a point that you make earlier, that absolutely
Yeah.
there are some benefits to great power competition, economic, technological, I'm sure, industrial.
Sure.
If you're building a machine to counter an enemy, then you get really innovative
Yeah.
and all of that. But I think there's another interesting point you made, which is, uh, I think Trump, in particular, has his brain is it's a lizard brain. First of all,
It's whatever will make me popular at the moment.
yes,
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
needs heat to keep his body function going, and then at night he
Yeah.
hibernates. But he sees things in a dichotomy. So yes, we're going to win against China. However, if if this is a fundamentally and primarily at least an economic battle, economics don't stop.
Right.
You don't we're not going to win the lottery and then retire. Like, this is
Right.
not how the country operates. And so I think that, to Tim's point about the getting us to the moon, um it feels to me, at least like what you're saying, is that, while the Cold War, for example, in the 50s, 60s, got us some great innovation, got us economic boosts, got us a big middle class, got us a lot of things, it also caused a kind of a tremendous amount of problems,
Yeah.
and Vietnam not being the least. Um, but now it feels like the problems that we're facing are somewhat more existential,
Yeah.
um, and that may be my bias as a child of the 70s and 80s, and not having grown up in that era. But we have climate change.
Yeah.
For
Exactly.
example, we have the fall of our own sort of right to self governance in some cases. How is this war with China co opting these actual problems, and how is it keeping us from solving real problems?
I think first and foremost, it's forcing us to separate domestic policy from foreign policy. I think,
Right.
to your point, I would say the imperative for me is reviving democracy within the United States, and that comes with not just sort of in a political sense and building new coalitions, but also thinking about restoring the cuts that Medicare,
Yeah.
and SNAP is going to experience over the next, months, years. A healthy democracy means taking care of those who can't take care of themselves. And what the China problem is doing, and I do think, again, China does pose a series of threats. I put it in multiple, not there's a China threat, but there's also a series of threats. But what focusing on the China threat does for Trump and people like him is that it allows you to separate domestic and foreign policy, to say that's the enemy, and tries to rally the American public around a foreign enemy as opposed to dealing with problems at home. And
Right.
that's kind of maybe a bit reductionist, but I think ultimately, in a basic sense, that's what's happening. Um, and I think what's interesting about Biden is that he tried to meld the two, right? He tried to say, well, we can have like a post neoliberal, economy. We can, get rid of this idea that the American public, is sort of left to the vices and virtues of the market, government can do good again. But that's not exactly um, it didn't succeed to the fullest extent. And now
Sure.
with Trump in power, he's going to go back to, again, separating these two things and pointing to China as a threat. And then not just that, but compounding the problem, of course, as we all know, by going after undocumented immigrants or people who aren't undocumented, just people who look like, in his view, undocumented immigrants. And I think that's to me what's going to happen over the next 4 years is that we'll see what Trump does with China. I think it's a question mark to a certain extent at the moment. But I think he's going to use it as much as he can if things get worse for his presidency as a distraction from how bad things are going at home.
Yeah, well, I was thinking about this earlier, and his domestic policy is wreaking havoc domestically. It's causing terrible chaos, and I think you can make an argument that at least one reason Biden squeaked by in 20 was people are sick of the shit, just the
Right.
constant flood of it, and so Trump is laying that groundwork again. However, his foreign policy, you would say his foreign policy is causing global chaos, but it's also causing domestic chaos.
Yeah.
Um, and so I want to ask you about this. He does point, he has a lot of distractions. He does a lot of things that are distracting and this kind of thing. Um, but in regards to China, if he continues to sort of point to China as the enemy, we need to get them under control. We need to do this. We need to do that. But he's also simultaneously sort of hollowed out the diplomatic corps.
Yeah.
He's hollowed out our foreign policy capacity, our credibility abroad. How it feel if I was she, I would be like, amazing, to bring it, bring this to
Right.
me. You are
Yes.
incapable. How
Yeah.
how does this play out under those current circumstances?
I think it's already playing out, in
Mhm.
that the willingness of the United States to cede so-called soft power, right, and putting USAID and diplomatic corps and other types of relief efforts abroad, like those aren't coming back. The State Department staff that was fired a few weeks ago, that's not those people aren't coming back, and some of
Right.
them are leaving voluntarily because the work environment's just so hostile.
Yep.
It just seems like my LinkedIn page is filled with the messages of people who are like, I've loved my job for many years, but I can't, I decide it's time for me to move on. And I think that's also kind of what's happening too, residually, is like he's just creating not just Trump, but the people around him are creating a culture that they don't want to be a part of within
Right.
U.S. foreign policy making, and so they'll voluntarily leave. So I think that's again, to your point, is concerning because that just leaves you hard power. That just leaves you
Right.
military power. And what we've seen over the past 20 years is that the United States' willingness to use military power to solve economic and political problems, and the ability to achieve the results that it wants to achieve through military power, is not the success. The track record isn't very a good one.
No.
And I think that's what's happening now is that Trump, like, hollowing out this, whatever smacks of DEI or whatever, is a project that they just don't like, they'll just get rid of. And so most of those things are soft power things. So there's what we used to call public diplomacy, or
Right.
cultural diplomacy. And this is happening also on the AI front too, in terms of AI and soft power. I mean, again, I think China's is with the development of DeepSeek is kind of leading some innovations there. But the United States, if you're looking at sort of tools outside of blunt force, the United States is just shedding those tools. And you're right. I mean, Z would like that, but also, you know, there are other people who would like that. And it also confirms for many people or many countries, so-called enemies, like this is really who the United States is, what the United States is always about. Like like the
Yeah.
soft power thing was just an edifice. It was just a subterfuge. Americans were just always about using military power to advance their interests. And you can look at the Middle East and the history of the U.S. foreign policy over the Middle East over the past 20 years, right? And that's again confirmation that people who believe that the United States is not really interested in helping the world. That's just widely, they can be widely accepted, or just proof of the situation at hand.
Yeah, a couple of things. One is we do a show on Lincoln Square called the Anchor Watch with Bobby Jones, and Bobby Jones is a
Oh yeah,
former Navy commander and really amazing. But he says, if I've been deployed, we failed. Our diplomacy has failed. Um,
right,
but that is not, this is Trump's first move is hard power. I
right.
mean, kinda. It's his first threat.
No, I think you're absolutely right. It's he likes peace through strength, and peace through strength means doesn't mean negotiations, to achieve global stability. Peace through
No.
strength means deterrence through military power.
And
Yeah,
confusing policy,
yeah, exactly.
through
Right. And what is
chaos.
and peace through strength, yet hollowing out, as you said, hollowing out the infrastructure that would give you peace through strength. It's just contradictory. It doesn't make sense.
It's inscrutable. Reverend Mary Phillips Backshire, hey, good to see you. She says, "I'm sick of one person causing so much crazy to us. The disparity between us and the rich is so bad they don't know one day will come for them." So I think this point to me is interesting. In a sort of indirect way because like we were talking about growing up watching Rambo and
Yeah.
thinking about,
Right.
what it means to be an American and not a dirty communist and what it means to
Right.
be the red, white, and blue, and we're creative and we're innovative and all this kind of thing. It's that also is hollowed out because it's because
Yep.
I again, I could be biased coming from, the left side of this equation, the non-MAGA side, but it with the Soviet Union, it felt like there was kind of purpose, and this feels, the great power competition between us and, say, China doesn't feel like it means anything. It's
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I
there's
think I think that's right. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, we derive no value from it, in other words.
Yeah, I think most Americans don't want it. I think the story of the history of U.S.-China relations over 20 years is that we have benefited from the 7 to 8% Chinese growth rates, over the Obama years. Like we benefited in terms of cheap goods. We benefit. Obama knew this,
Yeah.
and the pivot to great power competition is a way of sort of dealing with the fact that China has now become a rising power, if not a great power, and also dealing with the fact that the war on terror didn't really go very well, and that there. So what happened is there's a series of instances or things that are occurring simultaneously. One is that China under Xi is posing a series of threats. China's economic growth is developing in ways that confront and challenge America's power, and this concerns the foreign policy establishment. And then you get the war on terror being an absolute failure. And so all these things, three things and more, kind of coalesce in certain ways to create this moment. Oh, great power competition is here to stay, but the American public aren't signing on for that. There. It's
No.
not like there was a consensus taken, and American people want that. I think it's being put up on them. And you combine that with the backlash against so-called endless wars or forever wars that we saw during the Trump years and the Biden years, and I think it's going to come back. The critique of endless wars, is going to come back if we see things again continue on the path that they're going on. I think those things to me indicate that the American public is not really interested in a foreign policy that makes us committed to a long-term conflict, whether that means in nation building in Iraq or whether that means, trying to deter China from all fronts, economic and military for time immemorial. I just don't think that's what most people want. Most people want good jobs. They want to take care of their families. They want to make sure that the democracy is sound. Again, I would say that's the priority right now, is protecting our democracy. And I think, the current administration obviously um, is not dealing with those things, in fact, making conditions worse for Americans at this moment.
Uh, yeah, and that, by the way, that last sentence could be said just about almost anything they're doing. uh,
Yeah, no, exactly. Right. Domestic policy, foreign policy, there's, you know, Trump is fickle, he's mercurial, he's chaotic, and he is on domestic policy and foreign policy. And this will be our future over the next three. I
Yes.
mean, I hate to be like a Debbie Downer or, putting a dark cloud, but I just wrote a piece arguing like no one's gonna the foreign policy commentariat, people like me, Trump's not gonna listen to them. Like, why are we
No.
wasting our time? Why are we wasting our time trying to convince foreign policy to move in a certain direction? Better to kind of hunker down and start preparing for a better future and trying to work together in a coalitional sense to build a better tomorrow. And I think that's really incumbent upon all of us, not just you and I, but all of us. Yeah.
Well, I think, your mistake is putting your thoughts down in words on a page. Maybe Trump
Perhaps,
would
yes.
would listen to you if it was on a commercial in
Maybe.
the middle of Fox and Friends. Uh,
Maybe. Yeah, I gotta
uh,
get on TV more. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. But speaking of, Trump and we've kinda talked about this a little bit already, but the book, and guys, you gotta get the book. The book was published in January. We talked about this a minute ago.
Mhm.
I wanna know what has caught you off guard over the past 6 months. What did you not expect to happen? What did you expect to happen? And then after that, it's a big, long three-part
Yeah,
question.
sure.
I'm curious, what you would have expected from a Biden second term.
Yeah. I think with Trump, what I expected was a kind of a full-throated return to great power competition that we saw under his term, under his first
Mhm.
term. China is the threat. It's always the threat. All of our eggs, should be put in the China basket. Instead, what we got was maybe we'll retake the Panama Canal. Maybe we'll make Mexico, and maybe Canada the 51st or 52nd stage. Maybe
Go.
we'll go after Greenland and just annex Greenland. And the Chinese are like, "What's happening?" And
Right.
yeah, and maybe we'll make a deal and we'll make a deal in Gaza, and make a deal in Ukraine, and then so we got to your point, we got this very chaotic foreign policy that instead of a myopic almost return to China was like China got a back seat. Where under the Biden
Right.
administration it was the main threat. It was prioritized as the threat. I mean, Ukraine, yes. I mean, when Putin invaded Ukraine in February 2022, things changed. But the Biden administration came into office wanting to deal with China. And I think to your last point, so that's really thrown me off, and I still again don't know what Trump is doing other than tariffs and trying to constrain China through tariffs, which he's doing that to every country. So China's not exceptional actually in this regard. But I think to your point about Biden or Harris administration, I think what we would have seen, considering the things that were happening in the Biden administration, we would have still seen Harris focus on China, but they were trying to, under the last months of the Biden administration, trying to cool tensions down. They were
Mhm.
trying to sort of have this sort of track two or track one diplomacy and trying to make sure that there are better communications between Blinken and his counterpart. Um, I think Jake Sullivan was visiting China at some point. I think those things would have happened. We certainly wouldn't have. Would have seen the tariffs that Trump and Biden placed in during their administration still intact, but we wouldn't see these like whatever 145% tariffs, then that, and well, now I'll make it down 30 tariffs. It wouldn't be the sort of, you got 30 days to comply. Like, this is like we're holding them ransom kind of stuff. Like that's not effective way to deal with foreign policy and deal with any country. So I think you would see a kind of a China policy that still was trying to revive democracy, trying to build on some things that Biden did, and continuing that, I think there are problems with that, of course, because no one wants, again, a conflict that's protracted and doesn't have a clear end. But I think it certainly wouldn't have been sort of this rollicking, will he or won't he? What's going to happen? Where do we go from here? How many tariffs? What percentage of tariffs are we going to put on Chinese goods now? Oh, is he just going to, put tariffs on certain things and just cancel them? I think that's not what we wouldn't have seen. And I think that's, again, to your point earlier, that's benefiting China in many ways. Because they're just going to sit back and just, they're not, Xi's not going to take that. He's not going to take just Trump issuing demands at him. And I
No.
think that's what we've seen so far. Yeah.
Well, I think, not speaking as a non-expert on this, sh- Z has much more power than Trump, I think, gives him credit for,
Yeah,
or
totally.
understands him to have.
Completely.
Um, so one sort of more question. This may be the more difficult question. I think a lot of people in the chat are asking about or making comments about this is the American experiment is over, and we talked about this a little bit ago about you don't put this genie back in the bottle.
Right.
This isn't just a sort of difference in a subtle difference in policy between administrations.
Right.
This is a sort of remaking of American power in the world and domestically specifically. So how the hell do we get out of this? And it's we're counting on you, Michael, to get us
I'm
out of this.
trying.
But the the I think the broader question is maybe um we're never going back to the way it was.
Correct.
Is there a more sustainable or is there an optimistic vision for a future of American policy in the world, and our relationships with other powers?
No, totally. I think that's, again, we have to come up with that better vision. Otherwise, we're just um, resigned to apathy. I think that, or just, endless frustration. Uh, I think with the line I've been saying, and maybe it's a bad one, but the line I've been saying is that we should treat the post-Trump moment when it comes, because it will come.
Yeah.
We should treat the post-Trump moment as a post-war moment, where there's an opportunity to rethink American power and what it's done, and to assess the fact that the United States has not been able to achieve its goals in the foreign policy arena really over a generation. And I think the better vision is one that's internationalist. In terms of takes into account that the United States can and should be helping countries through um, debt restructuring, through economic relief, USAID, rectifying the problems that were in places like USAID, but building upon those institutions, creating multilateral institutions that check people like Putin and leaders like Putin, that want to take over countries. Obviously there are limits to that, and there are historical limits to those types of multilateral arrangements. But I think it's going to take if it takes a village, it's going to take an international village. I think to get us out of this moment, working with our allies again, in Europe, on better terms and more equal terms, but also a foreign policy, in my view, that prioritizes the concerns of the so-called global South, of African and Asian nations, that mitigate crises, economic crises that lead to refugee and migration crises that then fuel people like Donald Trump and fuel xenophobia and fuel nationalism. If you take care of the countries, or try to engage with the interests of countries in the global South on better terms, I think that's going to rectify some of the systemic problems, institutional problems, structural problems that we've seen materialize in global affairs over, again, the last 20 years. And I think we'll see if that vision, and maybe that's too utopian or pie in the sky, but I think that's where I would start, is to say, it's a really rebuilding moment, because you're right, things haven't worked. It's not working. We can't go back, and we need to take sort of a net assessment of where we've done what we've done, and really come up with better thinking, creative thinking about how to build a better future. Again, one that also prioritizes American democracy and its concerns, and how we can build upon democracy in new and better ways.
Yeah, and I think to that point, the global problems aren't going to pause while we get our shit
Correct.
together, right?
Exactly. Right.
And speaking of migration is, if you think it's bad globally now, this is the best it will ever be,
Correct.
right?
Climate change is going to make it so much worse. There's going to be climate refugees throughout the world in the next 10 to 15, 20 years. Yeah.
It's going to be a huge problem, and it's also the coldest it's ever it's ever going to be, and
Yeah.
uh,
That too.
there's
That too.
there is more life on the planet than there will ever be again. It is on that happy note. Thank you everyone for joining, and Michael. Guys, you got to get this book. Michael Brenes is the co-director of the Brady Johnson Program in Grand Strategy, and a lecturer in history at Yale, and a senior non-resident fellow at the Center for International Policy. And this is the book he co-wrote that was out in January, and you should really check it out. It's a really surprisingly fun read.
Oh,
For
thanks.
yeah, is great. And Michael, will you come back?
Hey, I'm at your command, Sam. You
Awesome.
know, you want me back? You know, we've been friends for too long for me to say no. So I'm happy to do
All right.
whatever you want me to
Yeah,
do.
I've got you over a barrel.
Yeah,
You're fourth
exactly.
now. You're
Happy
hopeless.
to. Yeah. No, this
All
has
right.
been great. I really enjoy this. You know, it's
Yeah,
been
this
fun.
is super fun. All right, everyone, thanks for watching. Watch strategy session tonight. We have um we who do we have? We have great guests tonight. Well, think of it. Uh, but you gotta see it. We're gonna open it's usually a, paid subs only. Oh, Jim Acosta we have on tonight.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
That'll be a great show. Stuart and Rick and Jim Acosta. We usually, it's paid tonight. We're opening it up for everyone, so come, make sure you join. And if you don't already, subscribe to, Lincoln Square. Awesome.
All right.
Thanks again, Michael.
Thanks, Sam. It's a pleasure.
Okay,
Take
talk
care,
soon.
everyone. See you.